The Grenfell Tower fire on the 14th of June 2017 that killed 71 people spread up the outside of a block of flats that had been wrapped in plastic that burns.
How was that possible? It jumped up all the way along the flats.
How and why it was put there is the focus of a police investigation and a public inquiry.
How was that happening?
But Sky News has identified the disaster is a symptom of a much wider problem. A national fire safety crisis, as increasing amounts of combustible plastic materials have been used on buildings of all sizes.
We've had a push to insulate buildings, and the easiest way and cheapest way to insulate them is using these combustible materials. And somewhere we lost our eye was off the ball.
As the plastics industry capitalised on the green agenda, the building regulations failed.
I'm afraid there will be buildings that are unsafe, and that must be a worry for the people who are falling asleep in them.
The danger from combustible plastics has grown as successive governments ignored repeated warnings to take action.
Do you know for certain that your submission containing warnings wasn't the only submission containing warnings?
Yes, I've seen other people's submissions.
And crucially, fire safety experts who tried to warn about the dangers were routinely silenced.
It's enough to shut you up.
I think perhaps more than anything else, other people were silenced by saying, "Oh, you better not say anything about that. Look what happened to him."
The cladding that burned on Grenfell Tower was made of combustible plastic-filled decorative panels covering a thick layer of combustible plastic foam insulation. Together, they're thought to have contained as much fuel as 30,000 litres of petrol.
We are at the early stages of a very big, exciting industry.
They were fitted to comply with rules brought in by a government desperate to meet its climate change commitments. In 2011, the Department for Energy and Climate Change turned to the insulation industry for help. They set up a committee to cut the amount of energy wasted by poorly insulated homes. Simon Hay, now a fire safety investigator, was on the committee with senior figures from many of the big insulation firms.
The point from the insulation companies is that they were going to sell a lot more insulation.
4 of the 10 firms represented on that committee were members of a powerful plastic insulation lobby group called BRUFMA.
I'm technical manager at Celotex. I'm also on part-time secondment to reconstruction.
A leading member of the committee was Rob Warren, technical director at Celotex, the firm whose insulation would be fitted to the outside of Grenfell Tower 4 years later. His take on the committee was revealed on a now deleted web page under the heading Celotex Enter Government. He said he was working inside government to shape this critical policy, enabling the insulation industry to maximise the benefits. His attitude reflected the aims of BRUFMA, which since the Grenfell Tower fire has changed its name to the Insulation Manufacturers Association. It states it has high-level involvement in the drafting and regular revision of British and European standards and building regulations. But according to Simon Hay, one topic was not raised in the Whitehall meetings.
Was fire and safety mentioned in your hearing?
No. I can't be categorical because, of course, there were many meetings which took place and they were a number of years ago. But from my recollection, I'm not aware of the fact that fire was mentioned.
3 years after getting inside government, Celotex took to the road. The building regulations had been rewritten to make more insulation compulsory for new buildings. Since the plastics industry sat round the table with civil servants in 2011, the UK market for plastic insulation has doubled. Last year, 4 million cubic metres of plastic insulation were fitted to UK buildings, enough to fill Wembley Stadium, and all of it can burn. But the industry stresses how safe it is. This video is from the website of a foam insulation manufacturer keen to show customers how it doesn't burn, at least not when a blowtorch is aimed at its foil covering. To highlight the problem with plastic insulation, which is all made from oil, we took the same product to a fire laboratory and exposed the uncovered foam to the radiant heat you'd get in a real fire. It burst into flames in seconds. As the use of plastic grew, the system of regulation was weakened.
And how sensible was that?
I think it was extremely stupid.
Architect Dion Lombard says the Thatcher government's creation of private building control inspectors to compete with local authorities was the first mistake.
As soon as you privatise something like that, I mean, we are dealing with human lives at the end of the day, public safety, which building control is actually essentially responsible for, is public safety. When you privatise that, you're putting it out in the market. You are putting firms competing against one another. Of course they're going to try and make a profit.
In 1999, the warning bells began ringing. Plastic cladding on Garnock Court flats in Ayrshire caught fire. A man died and 5 people were injured. MP Brian Donohoe fought for a parliamentary inquiry, and combustible cladding on tower blocks in Scotland was banned.
But in England, no change.
That's for the English people to answer the question to that. I certainly tried and they didn't want to listen.
Tenants in England and Wales got different standards as the Labour government turned to its official advisers.
Samples of gases taken at nose height inside the rig showed that death would have been very swift.
The National Building Research Establishment had been privatised 3 years earlier and renamed BRE. Now it had to pay its way. BRE's answer to the danger from plastics was to create a fire test for cladding systems. They would use the building regulations to manage the risk and get the plastics industry to pay. They called it British Standard 8414. And then the fire safety system was weakened further. Fire certificates were scrapped.
Before the Regulatory Reform Order, 2005, buildings had to have a certificate from a fire officer as an inspection at the end of a project. Generally, a system of self-certification by building owners is weaker than a system of certification by a fire officer. Somebody whose interest is directly to make sure his men and women fire officers don't die in fighting a fire, but there are holes in the Regulatory Reform Order that don't necessarily include the outside of a block of flats, which is Grenfell.
In 2009, with no fire certificates and market pressures in building control, plastic insulation burned on Lakanal House in London. 6 people died and 20 were injured. An inquiry by the London Assembly was told by the Fire Protection Association that building regulations have not kept pace with innovation and lag behind current trends. The government, they warned, should act immediately. The regulations were not changed. There is insulation available that doesn't burn. It's made from minerals. This is fibre spun from molten rock.
So this doesn't add to a fire if a fire breaks out?
No, it does not add any fuel to a fire. It does not emit toxic smoke, and it will help suppress a fire because a fire needs heat. Well, one of the key properties of a fire is it needs heat to keep on growing, and this will suppress the heat within that building.
But advertising that fact has not always proved easy. The plastic insulation industry is highly litigious.
Senior figures in the cladding and insulation industries have told us privately that they are constantly fearful of legal action from the plastic insulation industry. When Rockwool launched a marketing campaign 10 years ago to say that this product was more fire safe than plastic insulation, they were sued for trademark infringements and malicious falsehood.
The legal action tied up Rockwool for years and cost them millions of pounds. They still won't talk about it. A former government scientist told me threats left him worried he'd lose everything after he raised concerns. He's still too frightened to be identified. His words are spoken by someone else.
Having been at the middle of all of this at one time, it did affect my health. It was done very carefully. It was a threat to sue.
It's enough to shut you up.
Well, it is, because if you've got no insurance, you lose your house. It was a worrying time, and they were quite famous for it. People knew that this was the way they reacted. I think perhaps more than anything else, other people were silenced by saying, "Oh, you better not say anything about that. Look what happened to him."
Even the week after the Grenfell Tower disaster, the plastics industry was active. A paper from this laboratory on the toxic smoke given off by plastic insulation provoked a letter from 6 plastic industry lobby groups warning its publishers of financial consequences.
Obviously, it is quite stressful as well, because you would have to, all the complaints or all the attacks are taken very seriously by my university. It worries me at some point that if you've got complaints coming in on the annual basis, at some point university will come up and just say how long we have to handle that.
While experts worried about being sued, the fire safety regulations were not working. It would prove to be a dangerous combination. The deaths of 71 people in the Grenfell Tower fire, which was fuelled by plastic insulation on the outside covered with plastic-filled cladding, prompted a shocked response from the government. MPs were told the failure of building regulations and control was a surprise.
Until the Grenfell fire, many experts would have claimed that that system had served us well. But now we have witnessed a catastrophic failure on a scale many thought impossible in 21st century Britain.
But Sky News has established that the government department in charge of building regulations had been warned for years that the system was dangerously broken.
Responsibility for the building regulations lies here with DCLG, the Department for Communities and Local Government. After the Lakanal house fire, they held a consultation on how the fire safety rules needed to change. They received 54 submissions, but when we asked to see them, they refused. We found one anyway, written by insurance industry trade groups 4 years before Grenfell Tower was refurbished. It pulled no punches.
Urgent research is required, it said, into whether the building regulations are fit for purpose. Building regulation enforcement is not effective, with inspectors turning up less frequently, if at all. The government, they warned, should act to review the regulations. One of the signatories of that letter was the Fire Protection Association.
Do you know for certain that your submission containing warnings wasn't the only submission containing warnings?
Yes, I've seen other people's submissions.
And they also said something needs to be done urgently.
Absolutely.
We are going to be taking on the enemies of enterprise. The bureaucrats...
But the warnings weren't heeded, and the coalition government was on a mission to cut red tape. Instead of acting on the warnings, the government relied on the advice of its fire safety advisors, BRE. David Cameron was shown plastic insulation by BRE's chief executive, Peter Bonfield. By now, the market BRE had created for fire testing cladding systems had become lucrative. But it won't say how many fire tests the plastics industry has paid it to carry out on cladding and insulation, or how much each one costs. And it won't say how many of them failed and had to be retested until they passed. But one of BRE's biggest clients told us they pay up to £20,000 per test and that BRE is paid for dozens of them a year with a waiting list months long. But insurers think they might have identified a serious problem. They're calling into question the test itself.
It is a really stiff fire, but it's gently burning. In reality, we don't see that in modern construction anymore. We will see far more plastics used in a built environment, and it's likely that the fire, when it hits the external cladding, is going to be of a much different characteristic than that slowly burning wood crib.
A new fire test is being designed, more like a real building and with a fiercer fire. It will test plastic insulation and mineral panels declared safe by BRE after the Grenfell Tower fire.
We expect to see quite different results.
You expect to see it effectively fail?
Yeah.
As preparations were being made for the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower, BRE's fire tests were under pressure. The industry wanted to use more plastics. In 2014, to speed things up, a new method of approval was created. The trade body for private building inspectors, BCA, said if no actual fire test data exists for a cladding system, opinion would be good enough. They were called desktop studies, and soon they littered sales brochures. Mistakes began to creep in.
It is not the responsibility of the architect to question the scientific basis we are given for the makeup of materials and their performance. There's a lot of greyness in talking about materials in terms of their fire safety.
By now, the building regulation and control system that is supposed to keep us safe from fire was wide open.
It's kind of creating a house of cards. I'm assessing that that's okay. This document says that's okay. So other people say, well, that authority and this authority say that's okay, so I can say it's okay.
As the work on Grenfell Tower was being completed, BRE, in the face of so many widespread concerns, was paid by DCLG to tell them if tower blocks were safe. In a report dated April 2016, BRE said there is currently no evidence to suggest that current recommendations are failing in their purpose. The regulations, they assured ministers, were adequate.
We're at the scene of a major fire in a tower block which has been engulfed in flames.
Within 18 months, 71 people were dead. The government's shocked response was to turn to BRE again. Ministers appointed two of BRE's senior figures, Chief Executive Peter Bonfield and Director Sir Ken Knight, to a committee of 4 to tell them what to do. The owners of high-rise buildings were told to send cladding panels in for tests, which showed that building regulations and their enforcement had failed. BRE declared that every one of the 278 buildings tested were covered in too much plastic that burns. As plastic materials came down from buildings across the country, the shortcomings of BRE's advice to ministers was exposed.
In total, hundreds of buildings had cladding that was unsafe, from Grenfell Tower to these council flats in Salford. And it all goes back to that decision taken years ago to try to use the building regulations to manage the risk of combustible plastic fitted to high-rise buildings. These flats in Salford had plastic foam insulation and exactly the same plastic-filled cladding panels fitted to Grenfell Tower. And the whole system here was signed off by Salford Council's semi-privatised building inspectors.
It's now costing millions of pounds to make these flats safe, with extra foil tape applied to the plastic insulation and cement-based panels fitted to the outside. But any plastic foam insulation is only as fireproof as the materials used to keep heat and flames away. If fire can get to the plastic now built into millions of homes, schools, hospitals, offices and factories, it can burn.
12 years ago, we had a much different way of building in the United Kingdom, mostly with non-combustible materials, so stone and masonry. We weren't seeing combustible insulation. We weren't seeing the wooden construction that we see these days. And a big question mark, actually, about whether the regulations were really fit and appropriate for use. They really needed a fundamental review.
The green agenda to insulate homes took priority over fire safety, and experts warning that lives were at risk have been made wary of speaking out.
Every single time that you're getting a comment, quite many times hostile or complaint, it's always hit you because you're just thinking, what is it now?
With privatisation introducing market pressures into fire safety regulation and control, architects, developers and construction companies put combustible material on high-rise buildings that should never have been there.
You could choose not to use a combustible cladding material, even though it's snuck through a loophole in the regulation. It's a decision by designers and contractors.
It all led to the tragedy of Grenfell Tower. Sky News has identified buildings across the country covered in combustible plastics. But the owners have told us that with fire alarms, sprinklers and escape routes, their buildings are not the same as Grenfell.
Would you describe this as a crisis for the UK?
I think I would describe this as a crisis. I think fire safety is absolutely vital. And it's not just about the premises that catch fire. It's also about the fact that people should be able to live within dwellings with a reasonable knowledge that they are safe. I'm afraid there will be buildings that are unsafe, and that must be a worry for the people who are falling asleep in them.
BRE told us it works with multiple partners across various sectors, including government, the emergency services and the private sector. It said it's working to improve the built environment through research and the provision of testing and certification services, which are audited by the UK's national accreditation body. Celotex said because issues fall within the remit of the Grenfell Tower inquiry, it is unable to provide any further information, but is offering full cooperation with the ongoing investigations. A DCLG spokesperson said, "Nothing is more important than keeping people safe." After the coroner's investigation into the Lakanal House fire in 2013, government took action to implement all the recommendations. We are continuing to work on updating our fire safety guidance. And the Insulation Manufacturers Association, formerly known as BRUFMA, says it feeds into any building regulation reviews through all the usual public channels and denies it or its members have used legal action to silence critics. Grenfell Tower remains a crime scene. The Metropolitan Police says there are reasonable grounds to suspect offences of corporate manslaughter. Sir Martin Moore-Bick has promised his public inquiry will get at the truth of what caused the disaster, and Dame Judith Hackett is conducting a review of building regulations and fire safety. But it is far from clear whether anyone is asking why, with so little debate, so much material that burns is still being added to Britain's buildings.